Good evening, everyone. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman, and while we muddle through what I hope will be the final weeks of this pandemic, I wanted to keep connected with all of you by holding another town hall. This is something I love to do, and I look forward to resuming in-person town halls as soon as we can possibly do that. We have held so many town halls and forums on different subjects over the years, but I have rarely seen more interest in a subject than the one we're going to address tonight, safeguarding our democracy. Whether you are concerned about voting rights or election integrity or the ongoing threats that we face relating to the January 6th insurrection, almost everyone I talk to these days in every part of my district shares with me their concerns about whether we're at risk of potentially losing American democracy as we know it. I share that concern. It's a big part of what Representative Jamie Raskin, my guest tonight, and I have been working on for the past year and beyond. And it's why I wanted to dedicate a town hall to this subject. So we are fortunate in this conversation to have a bit of a ringer with us to discuss this issue. I have so many talented and knowledgeable colleagues in Congress, but if I had to pick just one to consult with regarding the Constitution and the legal and historical underpinnings of our democracy, if I only had one friend I could phone to talk about the state of American democracy, it would be the incomparable Jamie Raskin. So before I invite Jamie to share a few opening thoughts, let me take a moment to thank the local media outlets who are sharing this program tonight. We're also being live streamed on Twitter, and we'll make the entire town hall available on YouTube and on my Facebook page as well. And here's how it'll go tonight after we hear some brief remarks from Representative Raskin. We'll dive right into a Q&A discussion. I'll be reading questions that have already started to come in from many of you. You sent them in advance of the town hall. And then we'll also get to some questions that will be coming in live on Facebook as we go forward. Congressman Raskin and I might pose a question or two for each other as we go along as well. But mostly this dialogue is going to be driven by you. So with that, let me introduce Jamie Raskin. He is a constitutional scholar, former law professor. He serves on a number of committees that are very relevant to our subject tonight: the Judiciary Committee, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, House Administration Committee. Perhaps most important for present purposes, he's on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th insurrection, and he was the lead impeachment manager last year in the historic second impeachment of President Donald Trump. So, Congressman Raskin, Jamie, welcome virtually to the 2nd District of California. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Congressman Hoffman. I'm delighted to be with you and the people of California's beautiful 2nd Congressional District. And thanks for having me. It means a lot to me.
Well, thanks for being here. Do you want to set the stage a little bit before we dive into a Q&A? We're talking tonight about safeguarding our democracy, and it does seem to be on everyone's mind.
Well, there are obviously hours of things that we can talk about in terms of the January 6th insurrection, but let me try to encapsulate things for everybody, and we can use that as a kind of a launching pad for our discussion. But I saw essentially 3 rings of sedition taking place on that day, and the work of both the impeachment managers in the second impeachment and also the January 6th Select Committee have really helped to give much more detailed texture to what I saw. But here's what I imagine was going on. There was an outer ring that was a mass demonstration called by the president, you'll recall, for a wild protest. And that ring of protest became a mob riot, which isn't to say that everybody there participated, but lots of people did. And of course, 150 of our police officers from the Capitol Force, from the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, from the Montgomery County Police Department, which is one of the departments that I present as the congressperson for the 8th Congressional District. And there were also people there from Virginia. 150 of them were wounded or injured with broken necks, jaws, noses, vertebrae, arms, legs. People lost fingers, eyes gouged, traumatic brain injury in a number of cases, post-traumatic syndrome for dozens and dozens of officers. Okay, so that was the outer ring of the action on January 6th. The middle ring was the ring of the insurrection, and here you found a couple of thousand people who were part of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Aryan Nations, the militia groups, the First Amendment Praetorian, some religious cults. The Unification Church was there. There were Christian white nationalists. These groups had been preparing for a paramilitary assault on the Capitol. They were the first ones to smash our windows and to begin the violent assault against our officers on that day. Believe it or not, that was not even the scariest ring. The scariest ring was the very inside ring of the coup. And it's an odd word, I know, in American political parlance, because we don't have any real experience with coups in American history. And we think of a coup as something taking place against a president, but this was a coup orchestrated by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. And the whole purpose, of course, was to overthrow the result of the 2020 presidential election, which Joe Biden won by more than 7 million votes, in which he clinched in the Electoral College 306 to 232. Trump had gone to Republican-controlled state legislatures to urge them to void out the popular election and to substitute in pro-Trump Electoral College slates. And to their credit, the legislative leaders in several states, including Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, said no, they would not do that. At that point, Trump decided that they would go directly to election officials, and they approached around 30 of them, including most prominently Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, simply to urge them to find more votes. And Trump, of course, was caught on tape telling Raffensperger in Georgia, all I'm looking for is 11,780 votes. That's all I want. That was not Donald Trump trying to stop the steal. That was Donald Trump trying to steal the election and commit voter fraud with Secretary of State Raffensperger, who was a constitutional patriot on that day. Another unsung hero who said no, he would not engage in that kind of voter fraud. So the whole thing came down to whether they could get Vice President Mike Pence to declare lawless, unconstitutional powers on that day to reject and repudiate and return Electoral College votes to Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, at least those three states, perhaps Wisconsin and Michigan as well. But the idea was to get that 306 number in Biden's column down to below 270. At that point, under the 12th Amendment, if no one had captured a majority in Electoral College, the contest would have been kicked over immediately into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. And you ask, well, why would former President Trump want the election settled in, the House of Representatives with Speaker Pelosi in charge and Jared Huffman and a bunch of free-thinking Democrats? Well, they understood that under the 12th Amendment, if nobody's got a majority in the Electoral College, it goes immediately to a contingent election where we will vote not according to one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And so after the 2020 elections, they had 27 states in the GOP column. We have 22 states. One state, Pennsylvania, was split down the middle. So even if they lost the at-large representative from Wyoming, my best friend, Liz Cheney, along with Jared Huffman in the House of Representatives, they still would have had 26 states, and they would have declared Trump the president. He would have seized the presidency for 4 years. He likely would have come over and invoked the Insurrection Act and declared something like martial law in order to put down the insurrectionary chaos that he had unleashed against us. And that was basically the plan. And we lucked out in a number of ways. One way was that Mike Pence upheld his oath of office that day. He was one who did. Another was that we had extremely brave police officers like Officer Goodman and Officer Dunn and Officer Fanone and Officer Hodges. Remember the guy who got caught in the doorway and was basically tortured in front of the world, Officer Cannell. These people understood they were not just fighting for our lives and the lives of Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other just egregious politicians who won't even stand up for an independent inquiry into what happened, but they were standing up for democracy. And if you listen to our first hearing, I think you will understand that they knew exactly what they were fighting for on that day. And some of our colleagues who like to pose as defenders of the police or law enforcement have been exposed as absolute frauds because they did not stand up for the police or law enforcement. Many of them have voted against extending the Congressional Medal of Honor to these officers who stood up for us on that day. But that's another story, I suppose. But that's a general outline of what's happened. And then, we've just been trying to fill in the details to figure out exactly what were the interactions and the coordination among these three different levels of seditious activity.
Terrific. Well, that certainly sets the context for the January 6th part of our conversation on safeguarding our democracy. I know we're going to have some specific questions that'll take us into other pieces of this concern: voting rights, voter suppression, election integrity. So why don't we go ahead and dive in to the questions that we've received. And the first one is about the Select Committee. David from Larkspur writes in to tell you thank you, that you're doing a great job. But he also wants to know about the outcomes that you expect from the committee's work, including the time frame. So maybe this is a good time to just educate us a little bit about the purpose and scope and time frame of the committee's work and what you expect to come of it.
Thank you for your kind words, David. And the committee is working really round the clock. I mean, we meet pretty much, through the weekend and everything. We've had overwhelming cooperation from witnesses. We've talked to more than 400 people now. We have more than 50,000 documents. We've gathered an extraordinary array of video and photographic images, and everything on social media as well. We've only really hit kind of a bastion of obstruction and roadblocks right around the former president, and that's what's happened, with Steve Bannon and Roger Stone and Mark Meadows, who's kind of doing the hokey pokey. He's got 1 foot in, he's got 1 foot out. So that's what slowed us down. We were hoping that we could resume hearings and have a solid 2 or 3 weeks of hearings every day in March. It's looking more like that's likely to be in April or May as we try to collect all the information we need. Then we'll issue a report to Congress and to the country where we explain the events and explain the causes best we can. And then we will talk about what we need to do to fortify democratic institutions, all the way from the most street level physical reinforcement of the buildings, the windows, the doors, and so on, all the way to what we need to do to fortify the voting system and our elections and so on. I wish I could say that the attack was over, but I think everybody knows that we're still in the middle of this, as there are hundreds of voter suppression statutes around the country. There are hundreds more bills that have been put in, and there's an effort to centralize election machinery in partisan or state legislative control. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on. And, we had passed our For the People Act to try to overcome gerrymandering, to try to guarantee early voting, guarantee weekend voting, guarantee the right of mail-in balloting, and so on. And
I'm going to come to that in a minute.
So we weren't able to get that through. But all of this will, I think, we haven't written our report, obviously, but all of this will be in there, what we need to do to fortify American democracy against authoritarian attack from the outside against our constitutional order.
Okay. And some people may have the impression that this select committee, they're hearing about subpoenas and criminal contempt charges and things like that. They may have the impression that this select committee can actually press charges against people who obstruct or are found accountable in connection with the insurrection. Can you just explain a little bit about how referrals and those mechanisms work?
Well, we have no prosecutorial authority. We have investigative authority for the purposes of delivering this report to the Congress and to the people. We can make referrals to the Department of Justice the way anybody can make a referral to the Department of Justice. So that's not really any kind of special power, but we plan to make public everything that we're doing. And, look, the Department of Justice is engaged already in hundreds of prosecutions. And I know some people have been frustrated by the pace of their progress because, like in most organized crime prosecutions, they're starting at the bottom. So they're starting, at that level of the riot of trespassers and vandalism and refusing to leave and interrupting a federal proceeding. They're working their way up. So, we just saw the first indictments for seditious conspiracy handed down against Mr. Rhodes and the Oath Keepers. I think, without any knowledge, but I imagine that that's just the beginning of a whole raft of prosecutions for conspiracy as they move closer and closer to the top of it.
That's actually the next question I had. This is from David in Mill Valley. And we got a bunch of questions like this that came in on Facebook. People are frustrated at the pace of DOJ investigations and, are we on track for holding people accountable that were part of January 6th? And so also questions about the fake elector scheme that we're just starting to learn about, where there is a DOJ investigation. The essence of these questions are, what has the Department of Justice been doing for the past year, and how can we encourage them to get moving? So I'm going to be interested to hear what you have to say, Representative Raskin, about that. But I will just say this. I was encouraged by that criminal sedition conspiracy charge. That looks like a serious case. And I think it suggests to me that things may be heating up on the accountability front from the Department of Justice. I also know that this Attorney General is very, very mindful of the fact that we just spent 4 years dealing with a Department of Justice that was kind of captured by a politician and really compromised in its independence and its integrity. That's third world stuff. We don't just dictate that our political opponents get locked up in the United States. So I know Merrick Garland is going to go out of his way to make sure that, hopefully he will follow the facts without fear or favor, but he's not going to do anything that he or hopefully most of the country would deem to be politically driven or politically motivated. But what are your thoughts?
I agree with that, but I want to think about accountability in two ways. One is individual accountability, criminal accountability, and I do think the DOJ is rapidly accelerating its prosecutions, and it's starting to get to some of the higher ups in these various conspiracies against the democracy. But we also want to think about institutional and public accountability, because that's really the mandate of our committee under House Resolution 503. What do we need to do to prevent a nightmare like this from ever happening again? How do we fortify ourselves against coups and against insurrections? And so that's what we're looking at, and we need to educate the public about what happened. I mean, this was, certainly we said at the impeachment trial, it was the worst presidential crime against the Republic in the history of the United States, and this was the worst violent assault on the Capitol since the War of 1812, and the worst violent assault on the Capitol ever committed by domestic forces. There's been nothing like this. So we've got to take it extremely seriously, and we need to deliver a report to the public about what needs to be done. We are in this project of democratic self-government, which Lincoln understood to be a very precarious kind of thing. I mean, for most of the history of our species, people have been spellbound by bullies and tyrants and dictators and kings and queens and all of that. And it's America that started with the idea of we the people. And that's who we are, and we can't let go of that.
Yeah. Back to your committee, got a technical question. Norman asks about this issue of cooperation by witnesses. And I was glad that you mentioned that you've had dozens, hundreds actually, of witnesses that have cooperated, that you have talked to. But what about the ones that claim the Fifth? You mentioned you don't have prosecutorial authority. Do you have the ability to grant immunity so that a Fifth Amendment privilege would not be used or abused by people to avoid testimony?
We can extend to people so-called use immunity, meaning that nothing that they say will be used against them by us or any other governmental authority. So we would guarantee the secrecy and the closure of that process. Obviously, it creates certain kinds of risks in terms of people who are facing and should be facing criminal prosecution for what they did. But that is an option that is very much on the mind of our committee. People do have a right under the Fifth Amendment to assert the privilege against self-incrimination if they think they may have committed a crime, and they might be incriminating themselves if they talk about a certain domain of subject matter. However, it is not a magic wand that you can wave over the whole proceeding, as some of these witnesses are doing. They go in and they just, invoke the Fifth Amendment for
immunity,
everything, right? And much less is it a magic wand that Donald Trump can wave over his friends, and they don't even have to show up. I mean, Steve Bannon didn't even show up. It's very clear under the Fifth Amendment, you have to show up, and you use it in response to specific questions that might elicit a self-incriminating response. You can't just say, oh, I don't feel like going, I take the Fifth Amendment. If that were the law, nobody would ever show up in court at all. And the executive privilege claims, of course, have been slapped down by the Supreme Court, even the Supreme Court that Donald Trump gerrymandered. But by a vote of 8-1, they said there was basically nothing there to his executive privilege claim. The presumption is that if the president of the United States, here Joe Biden, says along with Congress that there's no valid executive privilege claim, that stands unless someone can come back to show some extremely compelling reason to overcome it. And the court said, not only is there no extremely compelling reason, there's no reason that's even been offered. They've just said, Donald Trump wants to assert it. And then you have people like Steve Bannon and Mark Meadows that think it extends to them. It doesn't even apply to Donald Trump himself. I mean, we don't have under our constitutional system an office called the former president or the ex-president. You're done with being president. You are a citizen like everybody else. You get called to testify, you come and testify, buddy. That's the way I feel about it.
Of some of these obstructive arguments is just shocking. I mean, people who didn't even have a position in the executive branch trying to claim executive privilege. So thank you for clarifying that. I've got a question. It's a little bit of a different tack on safeguarding our democracy. Maria from Healdsburg is asking us about the problem we have in trying to have an agreed upon set of facts in this country. I think she's asking about truth and wondering what certainly we as legislators, but also citizens can do to address this problem of sort of post-truth politics and post-truth reality in the country. I will hand it off to you, my friend, but I will just set the stage by saying I think as members of Congress, one of the things we have to do is just call this out whenever we see it and be part of the fact check, the national fact check to sanitize our political debate. But I think it's going to take more than just members of Congress. It's going to take everyone sort of reaffirming truth as a value that we care about.
Well, and Jared, of course, can wax very eloquent on this point, but our Constitution was written by Enlightenment rationalists who created the first Constitution in the history of humanity that separated church and state, precisely because the framers, who were all of a very scientific frame of mind, like Ben Franklin and Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison, these were people who wanted public dialogue and discourse and decision-making to be based on facts and on data and on political science. And so they were totally fine with people exercising their religious freedom and their worship, but not using it to dictate truth in the public sphere. There, they wanted it to be based on reason, empiricism, data, and so on. So what we're seeing today is a rebellion by certain quarters of the country against a rational public world, against the Enlightenment Constitution. And one political party, to my mind, is operating much more like a religious cult, where one person decrees what the truth is, and then everybody else goes out and repeats it like cult members. And I've said that directly to our colleagues across the aisle. I've said, if they continue the way they're going, they're going to be fit only for selling flowers and incense at Dulles Airport before it's all over, because they've suspended their critical thinking skills, and they've allowed someone else to tell them, oh, yes, Joe Biden lost the election to Donald Trump. Well, now that's the truth. And the rioters confronted the police with flowers and kisses and hugs on January 6th. Okay, well, now we'll go with that. It was a normal tourist visit on that day. Oh, and climate change doesn't exist, and so on. So you see what's happening with this assault on science and rational thinking. So part of the defense of democracy is the defense of reason.
Yeah, well said. So Alyssa from Occidental is asking about a different thread on this accountability subject. She's worried that some who participated in the January 6th attack are now running for elected office. And she wants to know whether some of our congressional colleagues who supported the coup, the insurrection, can be prevented from serving. And it's an interesting question, because my understanding, and you surely know this better than me, Jamie, but the first test case of this is rolling out in North Carolina, where our new colleague Madison Cawthorn, very much an ally of the insurrectionists, is being contested under North Carolina's state law that is a bit of a corollary. She's referring, Alyssa's question is referring to the 14th Amendment, of course, which in the aftermath of the Civil War was written to prevent people who took an oath to defend the United States and then turned around and were part of the Confederate Rebellion, to prevent them from holding office. That remains the law of the land. It hasn't been tested very much, but it's certainly the law in North Carolina, and they have a unique twist where when someone is called out for an allegation of insurrection, the burden shifts to them to prove they were not an insurrectionist. So what are your thoughts on whether one or more of our insurrection-friendly colleagues might have some accountability?
Well, the legislative history of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is fascinating, because when it came out of the House, where the radical Republicans were massed and headquartered, what it said was that anybody who participated in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, and there, of course, the paradigm case in their minds was the Confederacy, but they said that anybody who participated in insurrection or rebellion would be disenfranchised for life. That would have disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of people. And when it got over the Senate, they said that sweeps far too broadly. Let's just zero in on the most egregious offenders. And those are people who actually served in public office, swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, then violated that oath, betrayed the country, and participated in insurrection and rebellion. But even there, the Senate said, we're not going to disenfranchise them for life. We're just going to say they can never hold office again at the federal or state level. So they zeroed into that bullseye core of the biggest traitors to the country. And guess who falls in that category? Certainly Donald Trump does. I've got no doubt about that, because we've got concurrent bipartisan bicameral majorities finding that he incited a violent insurrection against the Union. And even though it's true, he beat the constitutional spread, we didn't make it to 2/3, but we still have a 57-43 vote, a majority vote in the Senate, a majority vote in the House, finding that he did it. And I think that should be sufficient to say that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment should apply to him. Does it apply to other people? I don't know. That's a question of fact. And it shouldn't just be one for, opining.
Yeah, we will find out, though, as the facts come forward in that litigation, because Madison Cawthorn is going to have to sit for a deposition, and he'll have the burden of bringing those facts forward in his case. That won't apply in some other states, but interesting stuff. I've got a bunch of questions, Jamie, that come in about contempt referrals and basically how your select committee will deal with people who just refuse to come in and testify.
Well, everybody owes us their truthful testimony. The Supreme Court has said that. And we know that an order coming from Congress to an individual to testify has the same validity and strength as an order coming from a court. It's the exact same thing. We have moved for criminal contempt against some people who have refused to testify. And we may move for civil contempt to coerce their participation in our proceedings. And it's also possible that we could exercise the inherent contempt powers of Congress. And we haven't said yet exactly what we're going to do, but I will just tell you that I believe it is the sense of the committee that we should be using every tool at our disposal to get the evidence that we need in order to make this report to America.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch gears here. Tom from Santa Rosa, I think, disagrees with you and me on much of this and has a different accountability question. He wants to know why there's no accountability for the riots across the country that did billions in damage and also killed people. He asks if we're picking and choosing which types of riots and violence to be upset about based on politics. I want to hear your thoughts, Jamie, but let me just say that, first of all, I think these are very different things. I think one of them involves property crimes and perhaps other type of unrest. And where people break the law in connection with that, they should be held accountable for those laws. I've never suggested otherwise, but it does not involve a plot to prevent the peaceful transfer of power or overthrow our democracy. So they're really apples and oranges, and I'd like to believe we're not engaging in any kind of double standard. But what are your thoughts?
Well, let's start with this. I'm a big champion, as I assume the questioner is, of the Civil Rights Movement, which was a nonviolent movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and CORE, Dr. King, of course, the March on Washington, and Black Lives Matter also is a nonviolent movement that has embraced and endorsed nonviolence. If there's anybody who's engaged in property crime or violence against individuals, they should be prosecuted for it. And I openly, enthusiastically support that. I assume the questioner openly, enthusiastically supports the criminal prosecution of the rioters and insurrectionists who beat up our cops. And I'm very happy to yield the floor to him to see if that's right. But in any event, rhetorically, this is obviously an attempt to distract from the first violent insurrection that delayed the counting of electoral college votes and interrupted the peaceful transfer of power. There are people who say that what happened on January 6th was just like Dr. King. It was like a return of Dr. King's March on Washington. On the contrary, it was never part of anybody's plans there to be nonviolent. And to this day, Donald Trump continues to defend and celebrate what took place there. You'll recall most recently, he said the election was on January 6th. The insurrection was on November 3rd when the election was stolen. So he continues to perpetuate that big lie. So I wish we could pursue the conversation in more detail, but I assume that my friend is not raising this as a way to distract attention from this violent assault on America.
Yeah, I hope not. But we do hear this moral relativism sometimes where, and it's often invoked to try to get us to not take January 6th as seriously as we do. So I share your concern and your disagreement there. The same constituent asks about California's election integrity, specifically the fact that, like many states, California allows third parties to collect sealed envelopes with people's ballots and to turn them in to elected officials. That's called ballot harvesting by some, and Mr. Schiff, my constituent, suggests that it invites abuse, that people could only harvest the ballots that help them and take others and throw them away or alter them, and that there are no controls. I would just say there actually are controls. Anyone who does any of those things is committing a felony, and they're going to be prosecuted. In fact, the one case we know of where this happened at a significant level was in North Carolina. It was a Republican trying to defeat a Democrat, and that person was prosecuted, and they threw out the entire election and redid it. So I think there are controls, but I also think we're at a time, especially during the pandemic, where strategies to make it easier for people to vote and encourage more people to vote are a good thing, subject obviously to those controls. Any thoughts on that, Jamie?
Yeah, just that. I mean, the truth is that the way that elections are stolen in America is by people who run elections, and there's been massive disenfranchisement in our history, obviously against African Americans, against women, against members of other racial minority groups, against students. And this is where election fraud is really taking place. in the massive disenfranchisement of populations that have a right to vote that's being trampled. But the handful, I've asked my staff to collect every case of real voter fraud that turns up from 2020. And I think it's running like 3 or 4 to 1 Trump supporters. One guy murdered his wife and then cast a ballot for her, right, saying he knew how she would have voted. So that does happen. And, they should add those charges on to the murder charges in that case.
Got several questions about gerrymandering. One of them from John in San Rafael is about the Supreme Court's decision that basically political gerrymandering is okay, that racial gerrymandering is not, and apparently they're setting up this exercise of trying to divine the intent of the gerrymanderer to determine whether it is permissible or not. Others are asking about, what can be done about various types of gerrymandering. I know you're probably going to tell them about H.R. 1 and S1 and the fact that we have passed legislation out of the House that would end partisan gerrymandering. What else do you want to say about this subject?
Well, there is that we've been trying to remove the situation where politicians choose the voters before the voters choose the politicians. Unfortunately, that's become a partisan thing too. And, the Freedom to Vote Act and the For the People Act have been stymied because of the filibuster. But, if you go back and you read those so-called racial gerrymandering cases, Shaw versus Reno, Miller versus Johnson, under the name of equal protection, the Supreme Court basically said, you can't have bizarrely drawn majority Black or Hispanic districts, but you can have bizarrely drawn majority white congressional districts. So in the name of equal protection, the court basically violated equal protection. But in any event, it created yet another contradiction because they said, we know racial gerrymandering when we see it, and you know what that looks like to, these justices who are running the Supreme Court today. But we can't tell what political gerrymandering looks like or what it is. And the court has refused to acknowledge that it could ever be justiciable, meaning that nobody can bring a case about political gerrymandering anymore. So we're getting more and more states where you have a complete shutout. The way it should work, and the way it works in most representative democratic societies, is if you have 55% of the vote, you end up with 55% of the seats, or some rough approximation. If you have 45% of the vote, you get 45% of the seats. But with the tools of computerized gerrymandering, a 6th grader can draw a state so that a 55% majority becomes a 100% majority in terms of the congressional delegation. And that's what we're dealing with, more and more states where it's a complete shutout, where you have, all Republicans from Utah, even though Democrats are 40% of the state, or you get all Democrats from Massachusetts, even though there's a Republican governor, because it's very easy to draw the districts in such a way to have a complete shutout. So we're going to have to evolve beyond that, but it is obviously going to take teamwork and cooperation between the two parties and the involvement of lots of people who hate both of our parties and want to upset the whole system, which has become obviously so rotten with partisan vitriol over the last several years.
Yeah, I having just come through my second round of independent redistricting, I think it's the only way to go, and it is what our legislation that we've passed out of the House would call for. So Brad from Sausalito wrote in to express concern over the prospects of a 2024 run by our twice impeached former President Donald Trump, and the possibility then of another popular vote defeat but electoral college victory, or shenanigans that might function like an electoral college victory. So I think this question, it's a long and technical question. I'll try to synthesize it. He's asking about whether interstate compacts might be used to help resolve our vulnerability to electoral count abuse. I think it's also raising the Electoral Count Act itself. And of course, we have heard that there is this bipartisan group that may be working on an update of the Electoral Count Act from the late 1800s to try to spare us from another exercise where someone thinks the vice president in that moment gets to go in and decide the viability or the credibility of the actual elector slates from the different states. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the very first bill I introduced when I was in the Maryland State Senate was for a national popular vote interstate compact. And I'm proud of the fact that more than a dozen states, including California, have joined that compact to say we're in a coalition where we will cast our electors, not for the winner in our state, but for the winner of the national vote at the point at which we have at least 270 electors in the Electoral College vote coalition. Somebody who used to support this, by the way, was Donald Trump, who used to blast the Electoral College and said it made us the laughingstock of the world, and how can the loser win and the winner lose? And then, of course, the 2016 demonstrated to him the magic of the Electoral College as it was being practiced.
Wouldn't that compact have to receive congressional approval to withstand challenge?
It would probably need to receive it, and I think, once we get to 270, I think it would be a matter of course for that to happen, I hope. But in any event, it does look like it's stuck in a partisan paralysis like everything else. We should do whatever we can to improve the Electoral Count Act. I mean, certainly we could formalize the vice president's role as a ministerial one, if not a ceremonial one, at least an administrative one rather than a decision-making one. I mean, Trump was trying to convince Pence that he could unilaterally expel electors and just get rid of them. I don't think we have to worry about Vice President Kamala Harris stepping outside of her role, and Mike Pence didn't do it, but it would be worth doing that. It would also be worth it perhaps to raise the threshold of objection from just getting one representative and one senator to 25 or 50 or something like that. I don't think any of these things is going to be a magic arrow that's going to solve our problems. As long as we've got a strategic bad actor who's willing to convert the entire electoral college system into a series of booby traps that explode in the face of the majority, we're just going to have to stay extremely vigilant. I don't know that there's going to be a technical fix to what ails us today. I mean, we've got to defend democracy itself. And majority rule is so threatened by all of this, everything in the bag of tricks, the gerrymandering of our elections, the voter suppression statutes, the manipulation of the filibuster, which is not in the Constitution, which is not in federal law, the manipulation of the Electoral College, and so on. So it's a race between the clear majority will on so many issues and on democracy itself versus all of these anti-democratic mechanisms that are being used against us.
Yeah, we'll see if Manchin and Susan Collins and others can actually come up with a 60-plus vote reform of the Electoral Count Act. But I agree with you. Even if they do, it's kind of small ball. It doesn't address the types of abuse and dirty tricks that we're likely to see in some of these Republican states, including simply nullifying or overriding the actual outcome of a given election and sending what might well be an inaccurate slate of electors to the House to be counted. Any thought? I've got several questions on that very fact that state legislatures are giving themselves potentially the power to override election officials and override the actual vote in their state. What can we do about that?
Well, that is an open question legally. In certain Supreme Court cases like McPherson versus Blacker and Bush versus Gore, the court indicated that it's within the plenary power or the total control of the legislature. On the other hand, there are one person, one vote principles, and Congress could act if we could deal with the filibuster, because the Republican guarantee clause means that we have to guarantee to the people of every state a Republican form of government, not a Republican Party form of government, but a Republican form of government, meaning a representative form of government where everybody's voice counts. So I think the wheel is still in spin on that one.
Good. Well, thank you. Let's see. I've got a question about extremism and right-wing fascism, QAnon, and other fringe groups that are increasingly violent, and what can we do about that threat? Obviously, we know our intelligence community believes that this is now the top domestic threat to our security, extreme
That's right.
Right-wing violence. So we've got to do more What are your thoughts from your perspective on the Judiciary Committee and on the Select Committee?
Well, Homeland Security and DOJ have both said it is the foremost threat, and they have finally done something that my subcommittee on oversight, the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, has been asking for a few years, which is the creation of an independent unit to focus on domestic violent extremism in the country. For all of my colleagues in the House who are defending the insurrection, and for Donald Trump, I want to ask them, are they just defending the QAnon shaman and people who beat up police officers, or are they defending the people who are now being prosecuted for seditious conspiracy and attempt to overthrow the government? Are they going to whitewash those crimes too? Because they've maintained a discreet and demure silence up until this point about that. But as the charges get more serious, we'll see whether they try to disentangle themselves or whether they really go down that road of just saying we're going to be a pro-insurrection, pro-coup party.
Yeah. Another one of my constituents is asking what happens to your Select Committee and its work if the Republicans take over the House next year? And that sort of, I guess, is a question about the timing of your work, but also, I mean, look, if they take the majority, I don't think anyone expects them to continue this committee. They fought tooth and nail against having an independent, nonpartisan commission, and now this bipartisan committee. But what do you say?
I mean, that's a self-answering question. I think they've said the first thing they will do is get rid of the committee. This week, Newt Gingrich said that those of us on the committee are going to end up in jail for what we did.
And unlike our attorney general, they still just jump right to lock them up, throw this person in jail and that person in jail. It's just remarkable the terms we hear from supposed leaders in the Republican Party these days.
I mean, it's a fascistic way of thinking about it. But your point is right, Jared. People have got to remember that Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell originally supported the idea of an independent 9/11 style outside commission with 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, equal subpoena power. And we agreed to that. Our emissary from the Democrats, Benny Thompson, who now chairs our Select Committee, he agreed to that with John Katko, who was sent in by Kevin McCarthy. And then when we had the agreement, they went back to their respective bosses, and Donald Trump told Kevin McCarthy no, he didn't want any investigative commission of any kind at all. And McCarthy turned on a dime and said, we no longer support it. I mean, that's a pretty terrifying thing when you think about it. And now the vast majority of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle denounce it as a partisan enterprise, despite the fact that it's as bipartisan as we can make it, because it's just Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger who will participate. But I got to say, it is the most effective bipartisan committee I've ever been on, because we don't spend all of our time in partisan invective and combat back and forth. We actually have a job to do, and we're doing it together. You know what it's like in most of our committees, Jared, where the first hour of every day we have to endure these ridiculous polemics.
That's true. It's been remarkable for me to watch. I've always kind of admired Adam Kinzinger, but Liz Cheney was someone I thought was my mortal enemy on so many different things, and never thought I would find myself admiring her. She has been a remarkable profile in courage this past year. And I wonder, this is not something anyone asked on Facebook, but I'm going to ask you, what's it like working with her?
Well, I've always liked Liz Cheney. We came into Congress together. She's a real family person. She's got 5 kids, and she's a lawyer. She's interested in the Constitution. So we've always gotten along. But really, I mean, I spend more time with her now than almost, any member. I mean, you and I are co-chairs of the Free Thought Caucus, the Free Thinkers, and we haven't had a meeting recently, but I'm in January 6 meetings all the time. She's terrific. And of course, they've made her into a pariah. I mean, I've been on the floor with her when Marjorie Taylor Greene just starts yelling at her and screaming at her and calling her a traitor and so on. And I noticed Liz has started to sit more and more over on our side of the aisle, just because they've made it so hostile for her in some precincts over there. their Freedom Caucus, their so-called Freedom Caucus, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz and those people really have wrapped themselves around Donald Trump, and they are attacking our constitutional order, by which I mean they attack our elections and our electoral outcomes if they don't go their way. I mean, that should be the foremost obligation of a political party in a constitutional democracy. If you win, great. Congratulations, you won. If you lose, you do better next time. I mean, the Democrats just lost a gubernatorial election in Virginia. We didn't storm the Richmond state capitol and beat the daylights out of police officers and go out on the internet and start lying about what happened. Yeah. You know, we sucked it up and we said, okay, well, let's look and see what we can do next time to refute their nonsense about critical race theory.
Yeah. So another one of my constituents asks, whatever happened to the Mueller report? Didn't Special Counsel Mueller leave some open questions about obstruction of justice and other potential crimes? And what's next? I don't know what, if anything, is left for Congress to do on that front, but certainly it's a fair question to pose to our new Attorney General, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what happened to the Mueller report was William Barr happened to it. He miscast it, he distorted it, he basically squelched it. And so, you know, I mean, this is the difference between justice in theory and justice in the real world. In the real world, it's just almost impossible to imagine the current Attorney General dusting that off and saying there are unprosecuted crimes here, or there are things that need more investigation. I mean, life goes on, and most crimes, of course, are never investigated or prosecuted. And, you know, our GOP colleagues are calling people who are going to jail for assaulting police officers and trashing the Capitol and interrupting the peaceful transfer of power political prisoners. They literally go down to the DC jail and they march around and call for them to be released.
So Jamie, I have a bunch of questions about what can we do, we meaning just regular folks, because it looks like our ability to legislate additional protections for voting rights and against some of these dirty tricks we've been describing is just running up against the limits of the filibuster, and it doesn't look like we're going to get Senators Manchin and Sinema on board with changing that rule. So additional federal legislation is unlikely in this election cycle. I think people are hungry to know, well, if not that, what do we do to defend against state legislatures who might simply throw out election outcomes and swap in new ones, or other dirty tricks, rank voter suppression and other things? I typically tell them we're going to have to be lawyered up, and we're going to have to challenge these things in court on what's left of the Voting Rights Act after the Supreme Court's Shelby decision and other decision. There still are some intact safeguards that can be used. There are groups out there who are lawyered up, ready to fight. And of course, we're going to have to probably work a little bit harder to get people out to vote and to overcome some of these obstacles. But I know you've given this a lot of thought. How do you respond to people that are wondering, how we're going to fight this fight?
Well, it's an excellent, urgent question, given where we are. I want to be respectful of the rules that bind us to talking policy rather than campaign stuff, but obviously there are answers relocated in a campaign space about that. But look, the great thing about our system with the separation of powers at the federal level, and then the distribution between the federal and the state and the county and local, is that there's always another arena to make the fight. And we have to defend democracy at every level. So becoming an election judge in a county that needs election judges, and to do, a fair and neutral and nonpartisan job, is an act of democratic patriotism, small d democratic patriotism. And so we need to support all of our democracy institutions that are out there, from the press to the state legislatures and the city councils. I mean, even going to a school board meeting where there are right-wing authoritarians who are trying to drive everybody out with polemics and vile insults and threats and so on, to go and stand there with the people who are honorably serving as school board members and people who are going to talk about real issues. That is an act of democratic courage and
Yeah.
civic engagement. So I think all of us have got to ask ourselves what we can do. And remember, sometimes people tell me, well, they're just burning out on this after so many years. It's you only burn out if you feel like it's your solo responsibility. It's not. If you're feeling you need to take the weekend off, take the weekend off and go to the beach in California, and somebody will take your place. And then some other time you take their place. So it's about taking turns, standing in solidarity. We'll get through it that way. I really think we will.
Appreciate that. I'm going to just squeeze in two final questions. We're nearing the end. The last one will be my personal prerogative to ask you something that I just want you and me to talk about, Jamie. But I've gotten a number of questions from constituents about, and I know you hear this all the time, when will there be relief from this hyperpartisanship and vitriol? And, when will, frankly, the Republican Party, come around to be more like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger? And, I will just say, as I tee this up for you, obviously I'm a partisan. You're a partisan. We are passionate Democrats. We're progressives. But when the system is working, there's a constructive friction between the two parties. We have vigorous debates. This has been going on since the beginning of our country with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, but we were all on Team America. We heard each other out, and we acknowledged that even our political opponents had valid perspectives, and we needed them to be in the arena with us. Something has changed recently with the way the Republican Party, most of them, not the Liz Cheneys and Adam Kinzingers, but the Donald Trump Republican Party, how they approach that most basic aspect of our two-party system. They're unwilling to accept that we even have anything valid to offer, and they're unwilling to accept election results when they lose. So it's not a particularly hopeful time, and we've got this media machine and social media out there where people have figured out how to make huge amounts of money off of the dysfunction and the conflict. I don't have a single solution to how we break through that and end it, but I think all of us have to think about how we make it better. And I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think you captured my thoughts mostly. I mean, I will say that every age almost believes that it's in an age of unprecedented partisan vitriol and bitterness. And you go back and look at even like Jefferson and Adams, who were best friends, but the things that they were saying about each other in that 1800 election, I mean, it was brutal. And so it does go back to the Federalists versus the Democrat Republicans. And I mean, you can find people saying some nasty stuff about George Washington, who got all the electoral college votes when he ran, But having said that, there are moments when people do seem to step outside of the existing constitutional order. And you can find some of the hallmarks in it in the use and deployment of violence, and also trying to question the validity of elections that have been upheld, as in this case, by more than 60 federal and state courts, including 8 judges who were nominated to the bench by Donald Trump himself. They've rejected every claim of electoral fraud or corruption. So, look, we know how to be nonpartisan when we want to. I'm sure if you call Congressman Huffman's office and you ask for help on a Social Security check or VA benefits or PPP loan, whatever it is, he doesn't say, matter. Are you a Democrat, a Republican, a Green, a Libertarian, Independent? Just says, do you live in my district? Because we're bound to just help people in our district. And then he goes to work. We know how to do that. And I think it's fine to fight like cats and dogs in the campaign, but when the campaigns are over and we're sworn to uphold the Constitution, we got to remember where the word party comes from. It's from the French word parti, a part. And we got to remember our party is just part of the whole. It might be the part we agree with the most about how to proceed politically, but we represent everybody, and we know how to do that when we want to. And we've got to think like that when it comes to the constitutional structure itself, because all of us are invested in it, and we've got to be nonpartisan and vigorous, zealous in defense of the constitutional system.
Yeah, and thankfully we have a lot of allies still on the Republican side. We'll disagree with them about lots of things, but they get this, and they're going to work with us in defense of the Republic. So we've arrived at the final question. It's a point of personal privilege that I get to ask this, Jamie, because for my constituents, you probably figured out Congressman Raskin and I are great buddies. We're friends and allies, and I think one of the reasons for this is that we are two of the staunchest defenders of the secular character of our government. We both feel strongly enough about that we co-founded this Congressional Free Thought Caucus. We've now grown it to 14 members, and it is sort of the vanguard right now in the Congress of pushing back against the encroachment of religion and would-be theocracy on the secular character of our government and separation of church and state. So that's the setup. The question goes back to January 6th. I think one of the things that hasn't been talked about enough is just how much there was a theocracy agenda behind the January 6th insurrection. A very clear one, led by pastors and religious zealots, primarily white nationalist conservative evangelicals who want to get rid of all public schools. They've got a very clear agenda that would just blast right through the separation of church and state and put us well on the slippery slope of theocracy. What are you finding as you sort through what happened on January 6th? And I know that working together in our Free Thought Caucus, we're going to be exploring this in more depth, but I wonder if you have some preliminary thoughts about how that played into the insurrection.
Well, there was clearly the presence of some of the dominionist groups and some of the fundamentalist Christian groups that have been Trump's most ardent supporters. It's a delicate thing we want to say because obviously most religious people in America totally opposed what took place there and found it deplorable. And a lot of great religious people were on our side. Having said that, there are what you properly describe as theocratic forces in the country who think that the separation of church and state is a myth, or at the very least a bad idea. And they want to reestablish the union of church and state. I mean, this was the great insight of the framers, to become the first constitutional democracy in history to rebel against the Inquisition and the Holy Crusades and the witchcraft trials and all of the cruelties of theocratic government. And up until that point, every government had merged with a church or monopolized a church to try to dictate to the people how they should think, pray, feel, and engage in politics. And so our framers broke that up. And they said, you can believe whatever you want, you can worship however you please, but you can't seize state power for one religious idea and then dictate to everybody else how they should think and how they should believe and how they should feel about stuff. So when we look at what's going on around the world with the resurgence of authoritarianism, fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, all of it, there are generally really strong right-wing theocratic forces at play there. And it's the same thing in America. So you're right to call it out. I always just want to be careful not to paint too broad a brush, because a lot of those people's main opponents are progressive religionists. And I think that's how we've made progress in America, a coalition between free thinkers and people who are on the progressive or moderate side of the religious spectrum.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So that's a great place to end. A reminder that when we talk about safeguarding our democracy in America, safeguarding that separation of church and state is part of it, maybe at the heart of it, actually. So, Jamie Raskin, you're a great friend and a great patriot and a leader in the Congress. Thanks for being part of a really important and substantive conversation for my constituents, and we'll see you in Washington next week.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the constituents of the great Jared Huffman.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.